There's something wrong with this place. I felt it the second I pulled off the road. The Snake River was calm when I arrived. I had driven for hours through southern Idaho, watching the sun dip behind barren fields and jagged hills, the kind of land that looks like it's been left to rot under the sky. I was tired, too tired to keep going, so when I saw the glint of water through the trees, I took the turn without thinking. I parked the RV less than 20 feet from the riverbank. The water stretched wide, black under the twilight, cutting a scar through the earth. The current wasn't strong, just steady, curling around the bends and disappearing into the distance. There was no campground, no other cars, just me and the river. I remember staring at it for a long time through the RV window. There was something off about it. Not the way it looked, no. It looked normal enough. But the longer I watched, the more it felt like it was watching back. Like I had pulled over somewhere I shouldn't have. I almost left right then. But I told myself I was being stupid. By midnight, I was asleep in the recliner by the window, the river glinting faintly in the dark. I woke up to silence, and I mean complete silence. The kind that suffocates, pressing in from all sides. I didn't know why at first, but I sat up, blinking groggily. The clock on the RV dash said 3:14 a.m. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the same steady stream I had parked beside hours ago. It was gone. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. Maybe the moon shifted behind clouds, or the reflection disappeared. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how wrong it was. The river was just gone. I stepped outside, barefoot, feeling the cold earth beneath me. The air felt heavy, like the pressure had dropped. I stood at the edge of what used to be the waterline and looked down. Dry, cracked mud stretched into the distance. Rocks jutted from the earth like broken bones. There was no sign the river had ever been there. No dampness. No receding line. Just emptiness. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into that hollow expanse. But as I turned to head back inside, I noticed something further down the riverbed. Footprints. Barefoot. Small. Leading toward the RV. I froze. I hadn't seen them when I walked out. But there they were, clear in the pale light, starting from the middle of the dry riverbed and ending just a few feet from where I stood. I scanned the area around me, but there was nothing. No movement. No wind. Just the footprints in the dirt. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path up to the RV door. My door. It was open. I know for a fact I locked it. I always lock it. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. The interior light was off, but I could see the faint outline of the recliner through the window. Empty. I stepped inside, one slow, deliberate foot at a time. The air inside was frigid. I swear I could see my breath. Something smelled. Faint but distinct wet earth, like river mud. But the floor was clean. I checked the entire RV, every cabinet, every corner. Nothing. But the footprints hadn't left. There were none leading away from the RV. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the driver's seat, staring out the windshield, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. By dawn, the river was back, smooth, flowing, like it had never left, but the footprints remained. It was August of 2019. I remember because it was the first time I questioned reality itself. Kelly and I had been planning the RV trip for months. City life had worn us thin, and the idea of disappearing into the barren quiet of the Oklahoma Panhandle seemed like the reset we both needed. Just us, open skies, and miles of nothing. I wanted nothing more than silence. Be careful what you wish for. The RV park was little more than a gravel lot off Highway 412. A few other rigs were parked at a distance, their lights flickering in the gathering dusk. We didn't talk much that evening. I remember how the air felt. It hung heavy, too thick for a summer breeze. It wasn't the warmth that made me sweat. It was that feeling, you know? When something's watching. Just out of sight, Kelly was inside making dinner, humming some old tune, but I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. I chalked it up to being tired and stepped back inside, locking the RV door behind me. As if that lock would have done anything. By the time the storm alert came through my phone, I could barely hear the rain outside. Tornado warning. Kelly glanced over my shoulder, reading the message with me. We need to move. Now. Her voice was sharp, pressing, but I just stood there, staring at the screen. I couldn't explain it, but something in me, something primal, said not to run. The map showed the storm was barreling straight for us, a crimson blotch devouring everything in its path. I could hear the wind screaming now, rocking the RV in uneven jerks. Kelly was throwing things into bags, ready to bolt, but I couldn't move. "Ethan! Let's go!" she shouted. And then it stopped. The wind, the rain, everything. One second the world was tearing itself apart. The next, nothing. No breeze. No rattle of rain against the windows. Kelly froze, half-zipped duffel bag in hand, staring at the sudden stillness. The only sound left was the soft hum of our refrigerator. I don't know how long we stood there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The sky outside was dark, but not with clouds. It was empty, blank. No stars, no moon. Just blackness pressing against the glass. I stepped outside. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd see the tornado in the distance, or feel the pressure drop. Instead, I found something far worse. A mile away, where the RV park's office should have been, there was nothing but torn earth. Like something had reached down and scooped the land clean. I could see the trail, a narrow path of destruction cutting clean through the horizon, yet our RV sat untouched, like a toy forgotten by a careless child. Kelly stepped out behind me, clinging to my arm. I felt her trembling, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The lights from the other RVs were gone. The rigs were still there, but the people were missing. There were no signs of struggle. Doors hung open, camping chairs sat around extinguished fire pits. Everything looked left behind. A low, groaning noise echoed from somewhere distant. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something dragging across gravel, slow and deliberate. I turned to Kelly, ready to tell her we needed to leave. But the words died in my throat. She was staring past me, her face pale as bone. "There's someone standing by the fence," she whispered. I didn't want to look. I had to. Across the empty lot, by the rusted chain-link fence marking the edge of the property, stood a figure. Tall. Still. I could make out no features, just a silhouette darker than the night behind it. It didn't move. It didn't sway with the wind, because there was no wind. I grabbed Kelly's hand and pulled her inside. We locked the doors. I pulled the blinds, but the feeling didn't leave. It grew. Kelly sat by the window, peeking out through the crack between the blinds. She didn't say anything for a long time, neither did I, until she asked the question that still haunts me. "Ethan, when did the lights turn back on?" I looked around. The other RVs, dark minutes ago, were glowing softly, but not with the warm yellow of interior lamps. It was blue, faint and cold, like the glow of a television screen in an empty room. We didn't sleep that night. I don't think we ever saw the sun rise. By morning, the RV park looked normal again. The people returned, friendly and cheerful, as if they had been there all along. When I asked the park manager about the storm, he gave me a strange look and said there hadn't been any tornadoes in the area. No storms, no warnings. I showed him the alert on my phone, but the message was gone. Kelly refused to talk about it after that day. I never found out what I saw, or what saw me. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I swear I still hear that dragging sound in the distance. It was July 2020 when I pulled into the RV park just outside Amarillo, Texas. The world was in chaos, but here, in this tiny forgotten corner, it felt like time had stopped. Or perhaps it had been abandoned altogether. The park wasn't much. A handful of RVs scattered unevenly, their owners likely drawn by the low fees and the promise of quiet. The air was heavy with humidity, the remnants of a recent storm clinging to every surface. Thunder still grumbled in the distance, a low, menacing growl that never seemed to fade. The office/diner sat near the park's entrance, its faded sign barely legible. Rosa's Diner. The paint peeled like old scabs, and the windows reflected nothing but the encroaching night. Something about the place immediately felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way the light flickered inside, or how the shadows didn't seem to follow the natural rules of movement. I parked my RV at the far end of the lot, away from the others. Solitude had been my goal for this trip after all. As I settled in, I noticed an odd silence around me. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a suffocating stillness. No crickets, no distant hum of highway traffic. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint tapping of rain dripping from the RV's roof. An hour or so later, hunger got the better of me. I wasn't in the mood to cook, and the thought of a greasy burger from the diner didn't sound half bad. Grabbing my wallet, I stepped outside and immediately regretted it. The air felt wrong. It pressed against my skin like a weighted blanket, damp and electric. The storm was gone, but the sky was unnaturally dark. No stars, no moon, just an oppressive black void that swallowed everything. I hesitated, scanning the empty lot before forcing myself toward the diner. The closer I got, the worse the place looked. The neon "Open" sign buzzed weakly, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked pavement. Inside, I could see a single figure moving. A waitress. She seemed to glide more than walk. Her movements too smooth, too precise. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but I ignored them. Hunger, or maybe stubborn curiosity, pushed me forward. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the warm, greasy aroma of diner food, but something cold, metallic. The kind of smell you would find in a hospital morgue or a room that hadn't been aired out in decades. "Welcome to Rosa's," the waitress said, her voice smooth and oddly melodic. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with a sharp bob of black hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wore a vintage-style uniform, pristine and out of place in such a run-down building. I glanced around. The diner was empty except for her. The counter stools were torn, the booth stained, and the floor bore the grime of countless forgotten footsteps. Yet, she looked immaculate. "What can I get you?" she asked, sliding a laminated menu in front of me. Her hand brushed mine, and it was ice cold. Not cool, not clammy. Cold. Like touching a metal pole in winter. "A burger and fries," I muttered, trying not to stare. Coming right up. She moved to the kitchen, and I watched her. Something about the way she walked, floated, set my teeth on edge. Her footsteps made no sound on the old tile floor. I shook it off, telling myself I was imagining things. The stress of the pandemic, the isolation of the road. It was messing with my head. But when she returned with my plate, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The food looked perfect. Too perfect. The burger was glossy, the fries golden and crisp, like something out of a commercial. But the smell was all wrong. No savory aroma. Just that same cold metallic scent from earlier. "You're not eating," she said, tilting her head like a curious bird. Her smile was wider now, stretching just a little too far. I am not that hungry after all," I lied, pushing the plate away. Her expression didn't change, but the air around me grew heavier. It felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows deepening, stretching toward me. "You should eat," she insisted, her voice no longer melodic but sharp, almost a growl. I stood abruptly, mumbling an excuse about needing to get back to my RV. Her eyes followed me, unblinking as I stumbled out the door. Back in my RV, I locked the door and shut the blinds, heart pounding. I tried to rationalize what I'd just experienced, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess. Then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The diner. From my window, I could see it clearly. The neon sign was off now, the building completely dark. But what chilled me to the core was the realization that there was no power line running to it. The diner shouldn't have had electricity. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, pale, smiling, and wrong. My heart raced as I replayed the events, trying to make sense of them. My brain screamed at me to leave, to drive away and never look back. But my body felt frozen, as if some unseen force rooted me to that spot. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A faint tapping on the RV door. I shot up in bed, my throat dry and my skin damp with sweat. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a stray branch, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm, slow and steady. For a moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. The silence outside was absolute, swallowing everything except that infernal tapping. Gathering my courage, I crept to the door, careful not to make a sound. My hands trembled as I peeked through the small window. No one was there. The lot was empty. The shadows of the other RVs stretching unnaturally long under a light that didn't seem to have a source. I let out a shaky breath and backed away, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned, my blood turned to ice. The tapping started again. This time, on the side window. I whipped around, and for the briefest moment I saw her, the waitress. Standing just outside, her face pressed against the glass, her lips stretched into that grotesque smile. Her eyes were wrong, glassy and lifeless, yet locked onto mine. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. By the time I looked again, she was gone. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my keys, ready to start the engine and get the hell out of there. But when I opened the blinds to check outside again, my heart nearly stopped. The diner was lit up, bright, garish neon spilling into the night like a beacon. The windows glowed with an eerie, pulsating light, and inside I could see movement. Shadows, dozens of them, shifting and writhing like a mass of bodies crammed together. I blinked, and the shadows were gone. The diner looked empty again, but the light remained, cold and unwavering. I couldn't stay. Grabbing my keys, I flung open the door and bolted for the driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the lot so fast I nearly lost control. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her face. But all I saw was the diner, its glowing sign shrinking into the distance. Or so I thought. After what felt like an hour of driving, I saw it again. Rosa's Diner. The same flickering neon sign, the same dilapidated building, sitting just off the road like it had been waiting for me. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. No, no, no. I hit the gas harder, speeding past it. But my stomach dropped when, 5 minutes later, it appeared again. It didn't make sense. I hadn't turned around. The road was straight and unbroken. Yet, there it was. The third time I saw it, I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop. The RV shuddered, the engine wheezing as I sat there, staring at the diner. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The air inside the RV felt thick, suffocating. Then, I saw her. The waitress stood in the middle of the road, her figure illuminated by my headlights. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was twisted in a grotesque mask of rage. Her eyes black pits that seemed to pull the light from the world around her. I couldn't move. Her mouth opened, impossibly wide, as if she were screaming, but no sound came out. Instead, the air seemed to vibrate, a low hum that grew louder and louder until it felt like my skull would split open. I slammed the RV into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away. But as I looked behind me, I realized it didn't matter. The diner was there too, surrounded. No matter which direction I turned, there it was. Rosa's Diner, glowing and eternal, a nightmare made real. The shadows in the windows moved again, pressing against the glass like they were trying to escape, or trying to get to me. The hum grew louder, deafening now, and I felt something cold and sharp brush against my neck. I whipped around, but the RV was empty, or so I thought, until I saw the condensation forming on the inside of the windows. Words. Stay for dinner. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in my RV parked on the side of a highway. The sun was rising, and the diner was gone. At least I thought it was. When I looked at my hands, they were stained with grease and something darker. Blood. And on the passenger seat was a plate, a burger and fries. The smell was cold and metallic. I stared at the plate for what felt like hours. The burger looked wrong, too perfect, like a prop from a staged photograph. The fries were cold, congealed in a shiny layer of grease. But the worst part was the blood. It pooled under the plate, sticky and vibrant, dripping slowly onto the seat beneath it. My stomach churned. I threw the door open and stumbled out of the RV, gasping for air. The highway stretched empty in both directions, nothing but asphalt and barren plains. The diner was gone, but its presence lingered, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I tried to piece together what had happened. Had I imagined it? A hallucination? A nightmare that somehow bled into reality? But the blood on my hands and the plate in the RV told a different story. I needed to get out of there. The RV sputtered reluctantly to life, and I drove, aimless and frantic, until I saw the first sign of civilization. A gas station. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I stumbled inside. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, glanced up from his magazine. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a smirk, but his expression shifted when he saw my face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone serious now. I don't know," I stammered. "There was a diner, Rosa's Diner. It's back that way." "Do you know it?" His face went pale. The cigarette fell from his lips. "Rosas?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got to be kidding me." I shook my head. I don't know how to explain it. Something happened there. Something... "You shouldn't have stopped," he cut in, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone or something to be listening. "Rosa's burned down years ago. A fire. Killed everyone inside. No one's been near that place since, but I was just there." I insisted. "I saw it. I talked to the waitress. She..." He held up a hand, his face a mask of fear. "Don't say any more. Just leave. Get as far away from here as you can." "But leave!" he barked, his voice trembling. I stumbled back, the weight of his words sinking in. My heart pounded as I returned to the RV, my thoughts racing. If the diner burned down, what had I seen? Who, or what, was the waitress? I didn't wait to find out. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that cursed stretch of highway. But even as the miles passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A week later, I was back home, trying to put it all behind me. I scrubbed the RV clean, desperate to erase any trace of that night. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night I saw her, the waitress standing at the foot of my bed, her lifeless eyes boring into mine. And every morning I woke up to the smell of grease and blood. I tried everything, therapy, sleep aids, even moving, but it didn't matter. She followed me. Then, one night, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. On my bedroom window. When I looked, she was there, smiling. This time, I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared, paralyzed as she raised one hand and pointed at the door. A sound came from behind me, a low hum, like before. And then, I smelled it. Burgers. Fries. When I turned, my heart stopped. My living room had changed. The furniture was gone, replaced with red vinyl booths and a linoleum floor. A flickering neon sign buzzed above, casting everything in an eerie glow. Rosa's Diner. The waitress was behind the counter now, watching me. Her smile widened as she slid a plate toward me. "Dinner's served," she said, her voice hollow, echoing in the empty space. The shadows began to move again, creeping closer, and I knew. I was never leaving. It was May 2021 when I decided to camp by Lake Mead. I don't know what drew me there, not really. Maybe it was the vague memory of a childhood trip, the image of the water shimmering in the desert heat, or the way it felt like the kind of place where the world couldn't touch you. But what I do know is that I wish I'd never gone. The RV rattled and groaned as I maneuvered it down the dirt path leading to the lake. The landscape around me was barren, almost hostile. Scraggly bushes and jagged rocks dotted the terrain, and the air felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the heat. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Like a shadow looming just outside your peripheral vision. By the time I reached the lakeshore, the sun was already sinking behind the horizon, its red-orange light spilling across the water. The lake stretched out before me, impossibly vast, its surface unnaturally still. It wasn't peaceful. It was dead. The moment I stepped out of the RV, the silence hit me. Not the kind of quiet you would expect in a remote place, where you might hear the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of wind through the trees. No. This was a silence that pressed against you, that seemed to suck the sound out of the world. Even my own footsteps felt muffled as I walked to the water's edge. I stood there for a while, staring out at the lake. There wasn't a soul in sight. Not a single boat, no other campers, nothing. It didn't make sense. Lake Mead was supposed to be a popular spot, wasn't it? The thought flickered through my mind, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just an off-season thing, I told myself. It was as I was heading back to the RV to set up camp that I saw him. A man, standing on the far side of the clearing, just where the dirt path disappeared into the shadows. He wore a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind fishermen might wear to shield themselves from the sun. But his face was what caught my attention. Or rather, the lack of it. The light was fading fast, and his features were obscured, like they were wrapped in shadow. But his eyes seemed to gleam unnaturally, reflecting the dim light in a way that wasn't right. "Evening," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like a whisper that somehow felt louder than it should. I froze, a primal unease washing over me. I hadn't heard him approach. There was no crunch of gravel, no rustle of movement. He was just there. "Evening," I replied, forcing my voice to sound casual, though my throat felt dry. "You camping out here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah," I said. "Just for the weekend?" He nodded slowly, his head bobbing like it was on a loose hinge. "You fish?" "Sometimes," I said. He pointed a long, bony finger toward the water. "Good spot just past the bend there. Big ones." There was something off about the way he said it, like he was reciting lines in a play he didn't fully understand. I nodded, muttered a quick thanks, and turned back toward the RV. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I decided to check out the spot he mentioned. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the kind of curiosity that gets you killed in bad horror movies. Either way, I grabbed my gear and followed the shoreline toward the bend he'd pointed to. The path was narrow and uneven, the kind of trail that feels like it's been forgotten by time. The further I went, the darker it got, the moonlight barely piercing through the thickening shadows. When I finally reached the spot, I saw what he meant. The water here was deeper, darker, its surface like polished obsidian. I cast my line and waited, the silence around me feeling heavier with each passing minute. That's when I heard it. A faint splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. I squinted, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then, movement. A ripple, subtle but deliberate, cutting through the still water. And then, I saw him. The fisherman. He was out there, standing waist-deep in the water, his wide-brimmed hat unmistakable. His head was tilted back, as if he were looking up at the sky, but there was something wrong with his posture. His shoulders were rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "You all right?" He didn't respond. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the soft mud. "Hey!" I shouted again. And then he turned. But it wasn't a normal turn. His body twisted in a way that made my stomach look right. Like his spine was bending in directions it shouldn't. His head snapped toward me, and even from that distance I could see his eyes. They weren't reflecting the moonlight anymore. They were glowing. I don't remember running back to the RV. It's all a blur. Branches clawing at my arms, the ground slipping beneath my feet, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, I locked it and collapsed against it, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I peered out the window, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the metal shell, set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, But when I mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning, I drove into the nearest town, desperate to shake the unease that clung to me. I stopped at a small diner, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Over a cup of bitter coffee, I mentioned the fisherman to the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. Her face paled. "Lake Mead's been closed for months," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, closed?" I asked. "Since the accident," she said. "A boat capsized out there last year. They never found the guy who went missing. Fisherman named Paul wore a wide-brimmed hat, always fished the same spot near the bend." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What happened to him?" She shrugged, her expression grim. "Some say he drowned. Others say he's still out there, looking for someone to take his place." I didn't finish my coffee. I didn't even say goodbye. I just left. The image of the fisherman burned into my mind. I haven't been back to Lake Mead since. I sold the RV, moved to a different state, and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the lake. In my dreams, I am back at the water's edge, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. And in the distance, I see him, standing waist deep in the water, his glowing eyes locked onto mine. And then, I wake up, drenched in sweat, the sound of his voice echoing in my ears. "Good spot past the bend there. Big ones." And I know, deep down, that one day, I will hear that voice again. But next time, I won't wake up. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to stretch a little longer than they should, I hear his voice soft, close, like he's standing right behind me. "I know what you did, Lucas. I know everything. It has been 8 years, and I still wake up drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming. I don't know if what I saw was real, but I know it was something I was never supposed to encounter. You can tell yourself all you want that ghosts aren't real, that people who vanish into thin air are nothing but stories to scare kids. But if you'd been with me on that dark stretch of road near Pismo Beach in September 2016, you wouldn't be so sure. Let me take you back to that night exactly as I remember it. My family and I had been driving up the California coast for days. The RV rattled and groaned with every mile, the engine making a sound like it didn't want to be there any more than I did. It was supposed to be a peaceful Twice-o trip. Jenna, my wife, thought it would be good for us. A chance to recharge, she had said. And Adam, our 8-year-old son, loved the idea of sleeping in a house on wheels. Me? I just went along with it. The trouble started late, around midnight. We had parked the RV on a quiet pull-off a few miles outside of Pismo Beach. It was one of those lonely stretches of road, with cliffs on one side and black ocean on the other, the kind of place where headlights only find emptiness when they cut through the dark. I had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, leaving Jenna and Adam asleep inside. The wind was colder than it should have been for September. It carried the sharp scent of salt and something else I couldn't place. Something metallic, like rusted iron. As I stood there, staring out into the inky black of the ocean, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. A rhythmic crunch of gravel under boots. I froze, my cigarette hanging from my lips. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and there was no one else around for miles. But the footsteps kept coming. I turned around, expecting to see some late-night traveler, maybe another camper. Instead, I saw him. The hitchhiker. He was standing a few feet away, silhouetted against the RV's dim yellow light. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see enough. He was tall, lanky, and his clothes hung off him like they didn't quite fit. A tattered gray hoodie, ripped jeans, and boots that looked like they'd walked through hell and back. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his posture oddly still, like he was trying not to scare me. "You got a light?" he asked. His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't used it in years. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping unease crawling up my spine. "Yeah, sure." My hands were trembling as I pulled out my lighter and flicked the flame to life. The hitchhiker stepped closer, just enough for me to see his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen sunlight in months. His eyes, God, his eyes were what I remember most. They were too wide, too bright, and the irises seemed to shimmer in the light, like oil floating on water. He grinned a slow, unnatural smile that didn't reach those shimmering eyes. "Thanks, Lucas." I froze. My heart stopped mid-beat. "How do you know my name?" He just stared at me, unblinking. That horrible grin still stretched across his face. I took a step back, my mind racing. Maybe he had seen the RV. Maybe Jenna or Adam had mentioned my name earlier. That made sense, didn't it? But deep down, I knew there was no way. Jenna and Adam had been asleep for hours. "It's a nice family you've got in there," he said, nodding towards the RV. "Jenna and Adam, right?" I dropped the cigarette, my pulse thundering in my ears. I could feel the blood drain from my face. "Who the hell are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. The wind picked up, whistling through the cliffs, but I swear it sounded like whispering low voices carried on the air, speaking words I couldn't understand. I stumbled back toward the RV, fumbling for the door handle. I wanted to run, to slam the door in his face and pretend I hadn't just spoken to something that shouldn't exist. But when I looked up, he was gone. Vanished. There was no sound, no footsteps, no movement. Just the empty stretch of road and the wind screaming through the dark. I climbed back into the RV and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely twist the deadbolt. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The wind howled outside, and the RV creaked in response. I turned to check on Jenna and Adam, half expecting to see that hitchhiker standing over them, but they were still sound asleep. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat with my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement. Morning came slowly, the sun creeping over the horizon like it didn't want to be there either. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. That maybe I had been too tired, or maybe the darkness had played tricks on me. We packed up and hit the road early. Jenna was in good spirits, humming along to some song on the radio, and Adam sat in the back, flipping through a comic book. I kept my eyes on the road, my fingers white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Every so often, I would glance at the side mirrors, half expecting to see that pale face grinning back at me. And then I saw him. We were halfway to Monterey, driving through a long stretch of empty highway, when I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road, his thumb stuck out in that universal hitchhiking gesture. It was him, the same gray hoodie, the same two wide eyes. "Lucas!" Jenna's voice made me jump. I glanced over at her, trying to hide the terror on my face. "Yeah? Did you see that guy back there?" My mouth went dry. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw him. He looked weird, didn't he?" I didn't answer. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We drove on in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching us. That night, we stopped at a crowded RV park near Monterey, surrounded by families and laughter. It should have felt safe. It didn't. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, like fingernails against glass. I sat up, my heart pounding. The RV was dark, Jenna and Adam still fast asleep. I listened, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, the air feeling thick and heavy, like I was moving underwater. He was there. The hitchhiker stood just outside the window, his face inches from the glass. His skin was paler than before, almost translucent, and his grin was wider. Too wide. His teeth were sharp and gleaming, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "I told you, Lucas. I know everything." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring into those impossible eyes as the tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. And then he was gone. The next morning, I told Jenna we were cutting the trip short. I made up some excuse about work, but I think she could tell something was wrong. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as many miles as possible between us and whatever that thing was. We made it back home in 2 days. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I found a photograph tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. It was a picture of the RV. Our RV parked on that lonely pull-off near Pismo Beach. In the corner of the photo, you could see a figure standing in the shadows. The hitchhiker. That was 8 years ago. I moved my family to a different state. I changed my job, my routines, everything I could think of to shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. But every so often, I catch a glimpse of something. A figure by the side of the road, or a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And I know he's still watching.